This is 6.1, Learning A. Please add 3 things to each slide and make sure to pause it after each slide is finished so that you can add them. So during the Great Depression, America did have a foreign policy, though it was largely isolationist. Terrible economic conditions throughout the world brought dictators to power. Oftentimes when there's national emergencies, the people of those particular countries, and generally those throughout the world, will decide to bring in leaders that want to take control of the situation, and that would bring more power under the government. Benito Mussolini begins what's called the Fascist Party and becomes leader of Italy in 1922. Essentially, this is the fascist concept stresses the importance of the state, which means not necessarily the state like you and I think, but of the government, and accepts the individual only as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. So you aren't important, but your loyalty to the country or the state is. What this does and what he does is he creates a totalitarian state. This is where the leader controls totally the lives of people. And also what happens is there's a very nationalistic sort of sense of this. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, which is in Africa. It actually lost to Ethiopia in a war decades earlier. So in order to sort of prove that they can do it now, Mussolini led Italy into that area in Africa. The League of Nations, which was designed to stop things like this from happening, complains but does nothing. You'll notice that is a pattern for the League of Nations. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things to the previous slide. Here's your boy Benito Mussolini talking about giving his speech. He's a fiery a fiery orator is what they're called. Another dictator that comes into power, that finds power during this rough economic times, is Adolf Hitler. You've obviously heard of him. He attempted to take over in Germany in 1923, but it's defeated and he's put in prison. During his time in prison, he wrote a famous book called Mein Kampf, that means My Struggles. By 1933, he's out. He becomes a leader of what's called the Nazi Party in Germany, and then becomes actually the Chancellor of Germany. And the Nazi Party is also fascist. He builds up military to a gigantic size. He sends his military right by France. It's called Rhineland. This was an area based on the Treaty of Versailles that was supposed to be demilitarized. The League of Nations complains, but does nothing. In 1938, he annexes Austria. Remember, annexes means adds. Austria is a country right next to Germany. Austrians are German descent. The League of Nations complains, but does nothing. In 1939, he annexes part of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, which had a lot of German ethnic people in it. The League of Nations complains, but does nothing. So here you can see an obviously aggressive dictator who's a totalitarian and controlling people, every aspect of these people's lives, in response to an unbelievably terrible depression that happens in Germany. It's significantly worse than in the United States. At one point, they're burning marks, which is the German dollar. They're burning marks because it's more valuable. It's more valuable to burn than it is to actually use to purchase. There's so much inflation. So you have this person who's using his military and aggressively adding countries, and the League of Nations complains but does nothing. Go ahead and pause and add 3 things to the previous slide. Here you can see pictures of his sort of hordes of people that would come to his speeches. So here's a sort of a picture you can see down here with Austria and then the Sudetenland here in Czechoslovakia. You can see the Rhineland down there is where he put his military. Go ahead and pause this, and with your island, I'd like you to talk about what the author thinks. What is his idea? All right, Japan. Japan actually becomes controlled by the military and is led by various military generals. They still do have an emperor, but the but what happens is the military is largely in control of the country itself. Way earlier, before the rest of the stuff happens, as far as the beginning of World War One, the Japanese military invades an area of China called Manchuria. The League of Nations complains, but of course does nothing. Also in the 1930s, there's what's called the Spanish Civil War. This is going to be basically a prelude to World War II. The fascist leader, Francisco Franco, is trying to overthrow the democratic government. So in 1921, fascists take over Italy. In 1933, the Nazis take over Germany, become the leading faction there. And during the Spanish Civil War, fascists also tried to take over in Spain. Germany and Italy are funding the fascist military in their fight against the democratic military. Mexico and the USSR fund that. So you can see there's sort of like the previous, you can see this is going to lead up to the actual World War II sides. The League of Nations stayed neutral, and it was a really sort of bad and deadly war, and but it's definitely a precursor to what's going to occur. Go ahead and pause. All right, so next, the U.S. isolationist response. In 1933, there's what's called the London Economic Conference. Basically, FDR decides not to go to this, even though its stated purpose was to end the Great Depression that was going throughout the world, basically talking about tariffs. FDR didn't go. The United States is largely isolationist. So it's sort of an example of the United States being unwilling to work with other countries. In 1935, there's what's known as the Pittman Resolution. This prohibited exports of American arms to war-torn areas, and specifically Ethiopia in this one. You can tell that they're trying to prevent something like World War I happening again, because most of the language in the Neutrality Acts, or these early 1930s laws, the United States is trying to prohibit companies from dealing with these war-torn areas, also known as belligerent countries. So in an effort to prevent, ships getting sunk, like the Lusitania did. 1936 and 1937, the Neutrality Acts passed to keep the U.S. businesses out of Spanish Civil War in Ethiopia. So these further identified limits on what type of economic activity could occur in Italy and in Ethiopia. Also limited political refugees and immigrants to 150,000 a year, because there were lots of German Jews that were coming to the United States. They could see the writing on the wall as far as Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf really blamed the Jews for pretty much everything, including the devastation after World War I. So there's some pretty inflammatory verbiage. So many German Jews did leave the area, and a lot of them were turned away from the United States. So go ahead and pause. Okay, you and your island, what I'd like you to do, this is obviously Dr. Seuss. He was a political cartoonist during World War II, so he often had pretty strong opinions. So what I'd like you and your island to do is go ahead and find and write 3 things that you think that Dr. Seuss meant, and the symbols, or what you think Dr. Seuss thinks, and the symbols. Also, the United States had what's called the Good Neighbor policy. This is reducing tariffs between Western Hemisphere countries. Promised that an attack on one country in the Western Hemisphere would be retaliated by all. This included the country. This included Mexico. And if you think back to World War I, if you think back to World War I, you know that the Zimmerman telegram was a major part of the United States entry into World War I. So you can see the United States is basically trying to prevent involvement in the belligerencies or the wars of European nature, and it's sort of attacking all the different reasons that the United States got into World War I. Go ahead and pause. So World War I happens. In 1937, Japan launches a full-scale invasion of China. and they do some pretty terrible things, and they really take it to the Chinese. In August of 1939, Germany and USSR signed a secret non-aggression pact, and it's basically promising not to attack each other. With that in their back pocket, on September 1st, Germany conducted what's known as Blitzkrieg and defeats Poland within a month. Blitzkrieg is a style of military advance where they would use tanks and airplanes. They would bomb places and roll through with their tanks and destroy as much as they possibly could without really stopping and setting up camp or anything. So Soviet Union and Germany actually split up Poland, and by spring of 1940, Germany occupied Norway and Denmark, which are in northern Europe. May and June of 1940, Germany defeated Belgium, Netherlands, and France, and actually controlled all of those. They basically went through Europe like a hot knife through butter. And again, they don't have to worry about the Soviet Union attacking. But the British were involved in this and were basically the only ones left to stand against Germany. Go ahead and pause. By the fall of 1940, German Air Force began what's called the Battle of Britain, bombing raids nearly every night for 6 months on cities, specifically like London and other major targets in Great Britain. People would hide in bomb shelters, and it was a really terrible time for the British people. In 1941, Germany ended bombing of Great Britain and helped Italy defeat Yugoslavia, Greece, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So Italy and Germany were in this war together. And Great Britain really always thought that Hitler was going to invade Great Britain, but he never did. And that's because, we're not really sure. And in fact, he might have actually won the war had he invaded Great Britain. But Germany did attack British bases in North Africa and had a lot of success there. So instead of invading Great Britain, in June of 1941, Germany attacked the USSR and advanced deep into their territory. So he went back. He's on the Soviet, the pact between Russia and Nazi Germany. They were not prepared for it. So by the end of 1941, specifically in October or so, Germany looked like it was on the verge of world domination in just over 2 years. Go ahead and pause. Here you can see the areas of Soviet Union on the right, Yugoslavia and Greece on the bottom, and France, Norway, and Finland were all occupied by German or Italian forces. Eventually, you can see here this dotted line based on the key is the extent of the German advance. So, beginning of World War II, the U.S. preparedness. Beginning World War II made the U.S. begin preparing to get into war, but not very seriously. When France was defeated, FDR began designing the government to be under his control and began building up the military. So the United States actually had a peacetime military draft, and they accelerated congressional appropriations to start building up the Navy. Remember, the Navy is a really important part of the Army. So the United States, even though it's not stated that it's going to go into war, the United States begins preparing for war. Go ahead and pause. So in the fall of 1940, Churchill asked for the U.S. for money, for weapons. The United States was still officially neutral, but Great Britain was really desperate. So the United States basically had what's called the bases for destroyers deal. 50 World War I destroyers for 8 military bases that the British had in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. agrees. It's often called the bases for destroyers deal. December 1940, Churchill told FDR Great Britain is out of money, so they need the U.S. to give them stuff. So they passed what's called the Lendlease Act. This is the biggest, most important law and probably saved Great Britain, because essentially the United States gave Great Britain all the supplies they needed and told them that they could pay them back later. This saved Great Britain, and it was also a major step towards non-neutrality for the United States.